about modern Tibet, and this is the first time we've done an event which is about the local history of Tibet. In many cases, people have talked about the general history of Tibet as if it's one huge entity. And this afternoon, we're going to look at a little bit more detail. I want to introduce this by, first of all, welcoming our speakers this afternoon. We're very honored to have Kirti Rinpoche here. Kirti Rinpoche is the Lama, the supreme head of the Kirti group of monasteries, the main Kirti monastery, very famous throughout the Tibetan plateau, and for many years the largest monastery on the Tibetan plateau in recent decades, until recently, is in what the Chinese call Ngaba, in Sichuan, Ngaba, the town of Ngaba, currently in Sichuan, actually part of Amdo. Kirti Rinpoche, very important in the Tibetan world because of his role as a Lama, as head of the Kirti monasteries and the other monasteries of the Kirti network. Also served as an official, as a minister in the exile government and in the private office of the Dalai Lama in earlier years. And we're very excited that Kirti Rinpoche has agreed to be here today. And part of the concept of asking our speakers to talk about history came from a presentation that Kirti Rinpoche gave a couple of weeks ago at a congressional hearing in which he focused on the history of his area, something that we in the university constantly want to encourage people to think about. What is the role of history, and what's the how should we understand the importance of the past when thinking about the present? Our other speakers, our second speaker is going to be Benno Weiner, who's sitting next to me here. Benno is in the final stages of his Ph.D. here at Columbia. Also is already teaching at Rutgers, has been together with me earlier at Tibet University for study, as well as in different places in China. And Benno's PhD is going to be very important in Tibetan history studies. It's on Qinghai in the 1950s. Next to Benno, Jianglin Li, becoming increasingly important in Tibetan studies as an independent historian and scholar who's been doing extensive research into the archives about the 1950s period in Tibet. And we're very excited that she's going to give us a taste of her work. She's already published one book, I think, Lasa 1959 in Chinese, a history of that whole episode in Lhasa, and she's working on other histories of that period. And last but not at all least, at the far end, Tom Grunfeld, professor here at SUNY, at Empire College, who's been watching the Tibet issue from his own and other perspectives for, 40 years or something. And very happy to we want to get his perspective on this issue as well. And also I want to welcome our two translators sitting near to me, Tenzin Dikila, who's going to help translate into English, and Kasan Wangdu, who's going to translate for Rinpoche into Tibetan. Both of them, we're thrilled to have them as graduate students here at Columbia. Thank you very much. I want to say a couple of words as in a kind of historical mode to set the scene. We are seeing a huge amount of media interest and response, and indeed we could say even sympathy in the Western media about events recently in Tibet. And those events, as everybody I think knows, have been marked by a tragic series of self-immolations, 11 in the last year so far. And most of those have been monks and people from nuns from either Kirti main monastery in Ngaba or from places rather near there, and some in Gansa, the neighboring prefecture. This has attracted a lot of publicity. I want us not to question today what are the immediate policies that have led to these things. A lot of us have talked about what's the role of policy in those events, thinking about more or less the present. Increasingly, especially actually my colleague Professor Tuttle has been trying to make us think about earlier events, things that happened 40, 30, 50, 80, 100 years ago in the relationship between Tibetans and the Chinese state or the Chinese government as it then was. How much are these key factors in trying to understand the difficulties that China has had in working with its Tibetan communities inside China? How different are those histories for different areas of the Tibetan plateau? Remembering always that for China and for most Chinese people, Tibet, the word only applies to the western part of the plateau. That was the area ruled by the Dalai Lama's government up to 1950 or effectively 59. The other areas, the eastern areas, are considered Tibet autonomous prefectures, but not considered Tibet when we speak in Chinese language today or read Chinese accounts. I want to remind us what we might be thinking about when we think of earlier histories of Chinese engagement with Tibetans, not just by the Communist Party, but here's perhaps the most famous one page from Edgar Snow's 1938 reportage. Some people would call it propaganda, a very colored account of his talks with Mao about, in particular, about the Long March. And in one famous page, famous for Tibetans and Tibet scholars, but little noticed by other historians, we get what is really the only mainstream reference in mainstream English language historical literature to the first encounter of the Communist Party with the Tibetans. And here we see the description, very glorified, rather romanticized, of the Communist Party on the Long March arriving in Tibetan areas. And this is a hugely important description because this is the only place, they claim, on the Long March that they did not receive a welcome from local people at all when they encountered Tibetans. Here they're called Mansu and Shifan, but actually these are names for Tibetan peoples that were used in the Chinese literature at the time. And there's a famous statement, I put some copies of this on the table if you want to see the full chapter. There's a very famous statement here where Mao says to Edgar Snow, talking about the fact that the Communist Party had to break their entire policy of winning over peasants as they made their journeys through China. Their policy was never to steal anything, never to confiscate anything from the so-called peasantry, from the working classes, but from the Tibetans they had to, because the Tibetans would not deal with them. So they stole, they seized, they took things, food, animals, and so on, and they fought their way through. And Mao said famously to Edgar Snow, "This is our only foreign debt." It was meant apparently as a joke, but it's probably, we should wonder if that really is a joke, and we should wonder whether Edgar Snow's joke is right, that finally the Tibetans came to understand the difference between red Chinese and white Chinese. Maybe they have come to understand that, but maybe that's still an unresolved issue, what happened there in 1935-36 in Ngaba, in the area that Rinpoche comes from, in the area where we are seeing these tensions today. So these are just some thoughts to put in. I'm going to pass the floor over to Benno Weiner, who's going to give us an introduction before we hear from our other speakers. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Robbie, for organizing the panel, and obviously my fellow panelists and everyone for being here today. Robbie has presented us with an intriguing question, I think, which is what is the role of local history in contemporary Tibet? And I imagine that some of my colleagues will discuss some very informative case studies that will shed a great deal of light on the subject. I'm going to try to address the question not by focusing on a specific case study, but by taking a slightly broader conceptual framework. Taking Amdo and specifically Tibetan pastoral regions of Amdo as my focus, I'm going to concentrate on what the Communist Party tried to do during the early to mid-1950s and what I think the consequences were when it failed to accomplish its own goals. The first question that we might ask is, does the past in fact affect the present? And as a historian, I certainly think it does, and I would argue that the Chinese Communist Party thought so as well. When it arrived in Amdo in 1949, the CCP was well aware that local Tibetan populations were at best deeply ambivalent towards their relationship with the Chinese state. The CCP was therefore deeply concerned with establishing its own legitimacy in Tibetan and other non-Chinese regions of Amdo. What I think is important to point out, though, is that this anxiety did not reflect a fear that somehow the party might not have a legitimate claim to Amdo, but quite the opposite. The CCP was concerned about legitimacy because it was sure of its own legitimacy as representatives of a new nation, and this new nation included Amdo Tibetans. The problem was that Tibetans, for the most part, did not share the sense of belonging to a multi-ethnic Chinese nation. They lacked what the CCP itself referred to as patriotic consciousness. And the CCP fully recognized, understood, and even rationalized this by looking at the past, as we're talking about today. In the early 1950s, the party argued that national unity had been severely damaged by what they called Han chauvinism, and they also referred sometimes to as national exploitation by the Han majority. This in particular in Amdo referred to the reactionary policies of the Ma Bufang regime. Ma was the Muslim warlord whose family had dominated Amdo from the 19-teens through 1949. Secondly, the party implicitly understood that what it was attempting to do in Amdo and elsewhere was transform a loosely integrated, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional imperial formation, which is the remnants of the Qing Empire, into a unitary multinational nation-state, which is called the People's Republic of China. In other words, the Communist Party had to transform the Qing into China. To both tackle the legacy of national exploitation and to transform empire into nation, the CCP implemented what might be thought of as a quasi-imperial strategy, which is called the United Front. At its most basic, empire in general can be defined as the linkages between an imperial center and several local elites. These elites enjoy considerable autonomy in their own domains in exchange for some degree of compliance and collaboration with the center. In other words, empires rule through the collaboration of indigenous elites. Without collaboration, there can be no empire. Ma Bufang himself, despite his vilification, much of it which is deserved, was himself an aspiring state and nation builder who sought to establish direct rule throughout Amdo and beyond. However, time and again, circumstances forced him to seek out imperial-style arrangements with indigenous secular and religious elites. For example, by offering them titles, recognition, and nominal positions in his government in exchange for various degrees of compliance, including, as Rob was just mentioning, organizing Tibetan militias to fight against the Red Army, or the threat of the Red Army as it moved into Amdo. Now, often these were the very same political and religious institutions that had been the agents of Qing imperial rule several decades previous. When the CCP arrived in Amdo, it struck the same sort of imperial arrangements with many of these same local leaders, now under the guise of the United Front. Both Ma Bufang's and traditional imperial practice, however, are essentially static. The United Front, on the other hand, was, as imagined by the CCP, was quite different. It was transitory and transformative. It offered a mechanism for national integration and a roadmap to socialist transformation. Local headmen and lamas were made leaders of new administrative regions called national autonomous areas. It was through regional autonomy that national unity and patriotic consciousness of non-Chinese peoples would be developed, leading to their voluntary integration of ethnic minority regions into the social state and their inhabitants into the new nation. Importantly, at least initially, socialism itself was largely absent from this program. Instead, this was a self-conscious program of nation building. Now, regional autonomy ostensibly meant self-ruled by members of the indigenous nationality, where they would become, quote-unquote, masters of their own homes, Dangjia Weiju. Like the United Front itself, most observers since then have dismissed national autonomy as little more than empty rhetoric. And in fact, history has shown that little genuine autonomy has been made available to non-Chinese peoples within their autonomous regions. However, by dismissing national autonomy as inconsequential, a crucial point has been missed. And that is that at least in the 1950s, the party took national autonomy extremely seriously as the primary institution of nation building. In Qinghai, the head of the Provincial United Front Work Department was named Zhou Renshan during these periods, and he made it explicitly clear that the importance of national autonomy in this process. For example, in 1951, he rhetorically asked a gathering of party cadres, quote, "Why do we want to energetically establish national autonomous regions?" To his own question, he replied, "Because national autonomous regions are this political form that best embodies national equality and is therefore the best method to consolidate national unity." National regional autonomy was considered, quote, a weapon by which to overcome the historical legacy of national exploitation, which again was the root cause of present-day disunity and international alienation. It was declared to be diametrically opposite from the past reactionary rule of people like Ma Bufang and the Kuomintang. Cadres were therefore instructed to contrast the party's policies of national equality and national autonomy with those of Ma Bufang and Chiang Kai-shek. Moreover, interethnic antagonism was not the only threat to national unity that the United Front had the power to overcome. Nowhere was its transformative potential more apparent than in its presumed ability to undermine tribal loyalties and identities in Amdo's pastoral regions, replacing them with the logic of the nation-state. According to the party, competition over limited resources had been exploited by the likes of Ma Bufang to keep tribes in a state of near-constant armed conflict. Zhou Renshan maintained, however, the process of establishing substantive and strong national autonomous regions is the process of moving from tribal division to democratic unity. By replacing national exploitation with national autonomy, the party reasoned that conditions that bred conflict and fueled tribal divisions would be eliminated. As per United Front policy, it would be the pre-liberation elite, the very same people who had entered into imperial-style relationships with Ma Bufang before, who would form the leadership of the new national autonomous administrations, albeit under the close supervision of parallel party organizations. The CCP therefore promoted policies specifically aimed at gaining the support of indigenous elites. In particular, and like in central Tibet, it promised not to interfere with religious practice and not to implement socialist reforms until the masses themselves requested it. In fact, in pastoral regions, class distinctions were not spoken of almost at all. Instead, and this is of crucial importance, I think, it was proclaimed that all pastoral Tibetans, including tribal and religious leaders, were collectively victims of national exploitation, and therefore were considered allies rather than class enemies. However, as might be expected, among the Communist Party's rank and file, there existed considerable ambivalence and even hostility towards policies that appeared to abandon all pretense of class struggle in favor of conciliation with the pre-liberation and, in their view, feudal elite. Zhou Renshan explicitly denied the exercise of national autonomy amounted to the protection of feudal structures and class enemies. Instead, he admitted that while on the surface the new system looked a lot like the old, instead it was a process of, quote, temporarily preserving and gradually changing. Zhou hammered this point home elsewhere, explaining to an apparently skeptical audience that delaying socialist reforms and preserving the pre-liberation feudal structure was itself, quote, a social reform that fit the specific characteristics that exist among minority nationalities, end quote. However, he asserted that this change, this social reform, could only come through a process of organic transformation in which the old gradually weakens and the new gradually takes root. Only when the masses cease to recognize the authority of tribal and religious leaders could they be effectively eliminated as an economic and political class. Through this process, backward nationalities would gradually transform into vanguard nationalities, marching down a shared multinational path to socialism. It was in this way that the party's imperial practice of allying with traditional elites was reimagined as a transformative process of nation building and a path eventually to socialist transformation. Now, just to sum up, as we know, by 1956, the impulse for rapid socialist transformation had begun to overwhelm the United Front strategy of gradual and voluntary national integration. Suddenly, indigenous elites, who up until this point had been considered co-victims of national oppression, were redefined as victimizers in a system marked not by national exploitation, but by class exploitation. No longer was national integration to be the primary mechanism for gradual socialist transformation. Instead, immediate socialist transformation was declared to be the primary means to achieve national integration. We know that starting in Kham in 1956, collectivization led to a series of uprisings that spread to Amdo in 1958 and culminated in central Tibet in 1959. In Amdo, the United Front at this point was negated, and the pre-liberation indigenous leadership, formerly local collaborators in the CCP's quasi-imperial strategy, were swept away. They were often incarcerated and in many cases perished. Whether or not the United Front could have succeeded in creating this newly imagined multinational nation, in its absence, empire was erased without the process of de-imperialization and nationalization having been completed. In the end, state building was achieved, but at the cost, I think, of legitimacy. And this is the point I want to make, is that nation building is in a large part a process of forming effective and accepted narratives of inclusion and exclusion. In this sense, 1958 severed not only the party's administrative strategy in Amdo, but also its narrative of national integration. In its wake, the party has been unable to find a suitable narrative that has proven effective in explaining to Tibetans their stake in a multi-ethnic Chinese nation. The process of nation building is in a sense the process of forgetting the violence of incorporation, not just in Amdo, not just in China, but anywhere, and replacing it with a communal memory, no matter how imagined, of a common past and a willingness to forge a common future. In Amdo, although the pre-liberation elite has since been rehabilitated and absolved from culpability in the 1958 rebellion, the insurrection itself is still considered a counter-revolutionary act. In other words, this defining moment in recent Amdo history has been rendered a perpetrator-less crime, but otherwise not attended to. As we saw as recently as the 2008 Tibetan uprising, the violence of incorporation, both physical and epistemological, has not been forgotten, leaving the Tibetan population, I think, incompletely and unevenly integrated into the Chinese nation. Thank you very much. This is an image right here of the commander of the PLA's First Field Army, Wang Zheng, entering Amdo and being greeted by Tibetan leaders and religious figures.
Well, thank you very much. There we have a really important presentation of the historians' analysis that state building in the Tibetan areas was achieved at the expense of legitimacy. That's the proposition. Let's move now from this more academic approach to actually asking Kirti Rinpoche to talk about his own impressions as someone born and brought up in that area in those times before he left in 1959. Kirti Rinpoche, please, we welcome you.
Thank you to all the scholars and listeners gathered here.
Danda Umbi number Niki Song ni ropes Nimbakala, number so Burgi Nedang Tola Shi, which so changing the ship. The Indian National Shuwe, maybe
As I listened to the two previous speakers, they know the Tibetan issue very deeply, and there does not seem to be too much for me to say.
That Tambode Tapuki Namu Logicita, Dandai Logici, Ni Nala Duni, Champion.
So I will speak briefly about the combined history of early Tibet and modern Tibet.
Jata Boni Nedante that Europe Trubinane is one ticket, and that took about the Jata Boni Nedante.
So the situation between Tibet and China is a situation that has been lingering, that has been the same, sort of the same situation since the 6th century.
Samsamla Jagita Tobatam, Samsamla Bertobacina, Jabuniga, removed Rogin, and the Padion de Chichade.
sometimes in this state of affairs, the Chinese have won, sometimes the Tibetans have won, and so there has been this competing state of affairs.
And the Gong Kana Nazire, Paratila, and then Jana, the Jajir and Jachin Buchi, some of them, and then you come on what you call all the Yagi, Church Temperature.
And during this situation, so there came a time when the Chinese wanted to extend their empire, and they wanted to gather the territory into one area.
Today, some of the time is one of the Jana maintain and duration, but
and that's how the name of China was also changed. It became Zhongguo.
Nanzu Bobali, Tandala took about the Zhongda Bobas in the Taiwan Shiki, and the Jata Post in the city, and the Mama Yonzoki, and the Garang Kanduya.
And we don't use that term Zhong. We say Gya, China, and Pe, Tibet.
Jata Pogubara, Netan, the Tanda took about the Pug, something on the Jurat, Sawan in Royal Mother.
And so in this way, in our minds, the state of affairs between China and Tibet has not changed.
Jason, the Maru Kanga, and then Jana, and the Pontre and Pentambo Yong Kamnes, and then Tanda took about the Jamie Nazola, Gangetashashi Mato, Roram Chisaji, Pasiomari.
And since the communists have come to power, and since they've come to Tibet, they have hurt us, they have harmed us, and they have not helped or benefited us.
Jamie Bola, Shuji in Sior, Mela the Tar, Shuji Sawaji Chiomare, Mendata, Trapu, and Juranzina, Gotambu comes on Tanda took about the Mendatone, and then Trapu and Juranziare, Jamie Gonsugi, Tampigiare, Mendican, so on so say, Tampigia, the Aron, and they love Tavior.
The Chinese say that they have liberated us, but they came with guns and it was done with force. It was not a liberation. There is a Chinese proverb which says, there is silence at the barrel of the gun.
Talo, Chindasumbina, Amdo Ngaba, La Cherto, Jamie Tamrachi Gala, Jamie Yigi Chimpushi, Chunksna, Jerry or Tigana Carry or Sona, mending a color, Nitan color, that's the trio.
In March of this year, in Ngaba, there was a banner that was hung in the marketplace, and on that banner it said, the barrel of the gun, listen to my mouth, and
the Mejan Chimbushi trio, Ready Gandela.
The barrel of the gun, listen to my mouth, and listen to the words that are coming out of my mouth.
Jason, Kanda Mendicani, and the Savans and Gayawat and the Savashirare.
So it is very clear that the silence in Tibet is being brought about by guns.
Jason, they and the Amdo Gavina, and Yogachi Yongu agency, so the Jamie Tranobton, Chonchi.
And the situation in Ngaba, it has happened because of Chinese repression.
Very Puyonzola, Jamie Tenola, Nendia, the India, Amdo Gavina, we second Nesu, Yongu, Jindicaris, 좋아지려이나 데라 아무도 나왜 나도 못 숨기는 게 나서지요레스.
Although there is the same repression and suffering all over Tibet, you may have the question, why is this happening particularly in Ngaba? The reason is that in Ngaba there's been 3 generations of suffering.
Yami Kumba Rinpoche tanda Kondakana Najire ni Tongchime Kasa Chidungu Songa the Sotu Pilotela, and then Yami Kumba Rinpoche, Penala, Zukabla, Tentambote, Amdo Ngawa Ranchu Kirksaku, Tentambo Zuere, Denis Wachike, and then Pumi on the Kangachi Butcher, and then Amdo Ngavisakula Bergi, Jarabogina, Megitambo Division.
When the Chinese Long March came to Tibet, the first area that the Long March came to was Ngaba. This was in 1935 and 36. And they brought a lot of suffering to the local people. At that time, the very first famine in history occurred in Ngaba, in Tibetan history.
Pumitani, and this Segunema Kalataki, drop, Kalataki, Mersway Indi, Pumila Magichore, the Ranazica Combatrasa, Mambola, the Kangama was used to Indi, Kaptiti, Pumisanana, Jamal Marwas and it, and the Pugichina result of Merula Muga in Bachika Pasha, named Bachita Posha.
The soldiers from the Long March forcibly took grain and foodstuffs from the local Tibetans, and from their actions and from what they did in Ngaba, it became very clear to the local Tibetans that the Chinese don't care about Tibetan culture and religion and the Tibetan people. And this is the generation of my parents.
Trade degated Lokjuba degated Kendichiga Yuans, and the Mami Yonchi, and the Polata to go get it to the Matet, that number of Chichimberry, as Goret and the Chidung with the Trusinangi, Junisaji last one number of Chichimberry. Tingay directed.
Now, when it came to my generation, this was in the this was around 1955 and 56, when the Chinese were first invading Tibet. They came and they said they were coming to catch the Kuomintang soldiers who had run away from mainland China. So they said they were coming to catch the soldiers, and they said they were coming to help the local people. And of course, all of that. Afterwards, we had the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, and I think that it was just that sentence. And then in the 60s, we had the Cultural Revolution. And this is the suffering and scar of the second generation. And the third generation is the generation that was born and brought up under the red flag of China. And this is the generation that is now deciding that they would rather die than live.
제가 모두 숨게는데 심고 막ate 아니 니동팀이 제기로네 종아지가 단다도 받아 엄청 나와서네 난 나서때마 나나지 마 돌아
So it is the pus that has come from the scar and suffering of the 3 generations that has now come out, that has now been released since March 2008 in Ngaba.
니동팀이 제기로라 엄청 나와나네 시골 종업가라 아니 무망그지라 멘데잖아 뒤집라 아니 미니스터슨 뒤집라 세월이 무망고 매를 무망고 성과지를 나오게 공부 다 볼때 꼴은 막 꼴네 아니 성과나지 진짜 두부죠.
In 2008, when there was a peaceful protest by the local Tibetans in Ngaba, the Chinese shot at the protesters and they killed 23 people. Countless more were injured. Many were put into prison and killed. And Kirti Monastery was surrounded by soldiers, and it was basically turned into a prison.
하고도 나로 진짜 선반이 좀 아직 아니 본조에 유미라다는 좀 아직 아니 나그디 보면 무색이 담라지 아니 강에만 뭐 쉬우치게인데 아니 보면 마모지 우리 탑재게 동네 아니 유미라다는 라서 좀 대나중 신부지 좀
Especially since March of this year, when Phuntsok self-immolated, the Chinese strengthened the repression in Kirti Monastery so much that people were driven to desperate measures and driven to self-immolation.
그래서 메라단 신부티 가르치었으나 여름 뭐지 볼라 배고 근데가 나중에 보면은 라마고에 지대라마고에 아니 로아미 도나고에서 빈 돈세 시대 아이 신부티 좀 알아.
When they were self-immolating, the slogans that they said were, they wanted His Holiness to return to Tibet, they wanted freedom in Tibet, they wanted religious freedom in Tibet, and they wanted human rights. So these were the 4 things they were asking for.
되게 신부 종어되게 단다 아리 종다 엄마 들어가는 잠내나 지대게 엄마가 신부들이 난것도 스네티 렌지가 나디 용이.
And I've come here to carry their message, to say this is what they're asking for, and to talk to the international community and the American government.
제사 단다 보나가 과서 우트고에 니수 가르쳐오르시나 과서 진도 론두게로 하면 봐 지대게로 하면 봐 아니 진도 다 보소이 있으나 쓰다다지 아니 뭐만 보시오지 중간에 지게 안 들어 나중에 가슴 재미지 라로야 아니 좀 정보매 봐 왜나 부서다게 과 쪽긴게 아샤다 안에 아샤다 빈자라서 와라 그 생일이지 아니 니와게 너무 못다지 근데 지금도 뭔가 심나가 맞으바 쉬우지요.
And the way Tibetans are driven to desperate measures are they have had no, they've been deprived of their freedom of movement, freedom of religion, and subjected to bad and inhumane laws. For example, if we look at Pinzok's case, his relatives who saved him were afterwards given long prison sentences. His uncle and other relatives were given prison sentences. So for about 7 months, there has been this very, very difficult situation in Kirti Monastery, and its results we are now seeing. As Chairman Mao said, where there is oppression, there is uprising. If we look at the Chinese and Tibetan emperors, there has been a long relationship, even of marriage, and among the people, among the Chinese people and the Tibetan people, there has been a very long friendship and a relationship, and we have many things in common, such as religion.
Inaya janagam goji rumbasambati tone ane dandage nitu nyorate ane murk nyori ngola jurne tensa pache janage mamange amjota mugni de kabje ane bumurki tapsu ngola jubi juda shikchimbuchi.
But now the third generation of leaders in China, they are the ones who's taking this problem and turning it into a problem of nationality. They're the ones who are broadcasting this problem as a problem of nationality throughout China.
When ngata vichajana chunjugala jamiwane ya asayomare ndane jaji jadugu jaji javishi Jianglin Li Pona Mata Buchia Chimbai, at the Rekablaina, Jamari the Bumiri Parade, Gasuti or Merkin Gasuti or Mari.
When I was younger, when I went to Lhasa, and later in the 80s, when I went back to Tibet, I could see that old relationship is not there. It's a different relationship. And in 1959, when I fled Tibet, I was escaping from Chinese control, but it was not a problem of nationality. But now it has come to such a state that if a Tibetan were to go to a hotel or try to rent a car and they were wearing their robes, they would not be allowed to get a room at a hotel or to rent the car.
제가 때가 가르친 중에서는 주자 로가지 인지벨라 니치도 중앙.
And this is a result of the propaganda that has been built up.
주자니 배순직 나오기도 군 동시고.
And I'll give you one example relating to Kirti Monastery.
그때 공부에 나라 송막한 나라 선생님과 몸부 비는네 대한 송아지게 레다스이면서야 레진 선생 몸부 님바 푸샤요. 되게 된 다네니 동 제거로 맞된 그때 공부에 자나쇼는 몰로스게 락처르스네. 왜 전된다 저자식 친구지에.
In Kirti Monastery, there is a room where the weapons are kept, but it was actually all the weapons were just objects that Tibetans had given to the monastery, saying, "I will give up hunting wild animals from this point." So it was all weaponry that the local people had given up. And afterwards, the Chinese government advertised these weapons as weapons that the monastery had hidden for struggle against the Chinese state.
대단 대신에 주자 지마 몸부지에인데 자나몸만 생각나는 거는 지중시에 면도 선배 똑같아야지 등이 자기가.
So, as with this and other cases, because there's been so much propaganda and bad information released to the media and to the Chinese public are now starting to think that there is some truth to these stories.
제사 땅에 놀디는 보육이 내당 년바당 사와니까 놀디 있는 바치우서지.
And this is my summation of the events that happened in Old Tibet and in New Modern Tibet.
Number so kiwa number down any jeune any tanda pomye number so tone any jana moment de ngomong de deli ni sewa chiki number so tuja nango yeteda any ya shunji chiga inaya ni su ngoma bogi ni su ngoma kare yime sashi nango yete naso ke chishujire.
The Chinese people are ignorant as to the true nature of the situation and the true state of affairs. So I would request all the scholars and the students here to try to bring more awareness about what is truly happening.
대한민국 생긴 전남 모먼데 여러 조선의 지구에 계시슈에 니에살라 모자게 부주 지로지기니 종아지가 전남 모먼 여러 조선의 시라라 남자들이 서울시 용기요.
And recently there was a case where cars had run over a child. So it seems that the cultural morality of the Chinese people, it seems that it can change towards a more positive morality.
전남 모먼도 전나고 우치 남바서 여러 조선 중에는 전남 모먼에 있는 디지 연구를라 가서 부면에 있는 디지 연구를 디인게 남바서 돈에 전남 모먼 여러 조선에서 조선한테 지라다 우치 남바서 여러 조선한테 지라 아니 내가 나신 게 전나 우치 남바서 또 모먼 신인한테 지라 도가 남바서 식지 준비이나 해도서 싫어 용서를.
If the Chinese leaders and the Chinese public act in the right way, And if they can become more enlightened in these respects, and if people here can make the effort to help towards that end, then I think it would be helpful.
아주 범위를 채잖아. 자나 뭐뭐 동시에 망부되게 가서도 접주 요구에 개치시를.
For us Tibetans, it is so important to have the support of the million Chinese citizens.
계산대인데 넘버스 자나 뭐만 아주 조건을 지어야지 또 넘버스 배선 나오나서 쉬어 리버시기.
So I would request all of you to help to help the Chinese become our friends.
그렇지.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rinpoche. And I was particularly struck by the use of the word scar. Should we think of history as like a wound that in some cases has not fully healed? And in some cases, is there a kind of way we can help those scars to heal? Maybe that's a thought we could have. As we move to our next speaker, I'm very proud to welcome Li Jianglin. It's coming.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to talk something about 1950s. Last recent years, I've been focusing my research on what happened in 1950s. In particularly those years, why I call that a secret war, because it is a war which hasn't been properly studied by outside, and also the Chinese government never really gave any details about this war. So I've been focusing on that. Today I'm going to show you some statistics and war maps. Since Robbie only gave me 10 minutes, I cannot really talk about the whole big war that has 6 years in 10 minutes. So just something, I'm focused on the human side and the property damage and monastery, all this is maybe another time. Let me see. Okay, this is the war map in 1958 fought in Qinghai. I have three, but this one is the most, is the high time. Now you see all those pockets? All those pockets are major